This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. The most recently published book in the series this year, 2024, is Animal Activism on and Off Screen, which is edited by Claire Parkinson and Lara Herring. Contributors include Eva Heifer-Giroux, whose chapter concerns celebrity activism, and whose name will be familiar to regular listeners of Knowing Animals. Another name that will be familiar to regular listeners is that of today's guest, who is appearing on Knowing Animals for the second time. Dr. Liza Bauer is the scientific manager of the Panel on Planetary Thinking project at the University of Giessen in Germany, having recently completed a PhD on literary animal studies at the same institution. Today we're going to talk about her book Livestock and Literature, Reimagining Postanimal Companion Species, which is published by Palgrave Macmillan as part of their series Palgrave Studies in Animals and Literature in 2024. Welcome to the podcast, Liza.
Welcome everyone, I'm happy to be here.
So can you start by telling us what led you to write this book?
As you've already mentioned that it has emerged from my PhD thesis, I guess it's always tricky to really pinpoint that to a specific time. But I guess an important moment on that was while I was writing my MA thesis and I was researching on human-animal relationships as portrayed in William Blake's poetry. And I was just really starting to venture out into the field. And then I read Susan McHugh's animal stories narrating across species lines. And I got super fascinated, completely distracted from my actual topic because she had this chapter in there about pigs in literature and particularly also about how representations of meat and how actually pig characters keep appearing more in form of meat than in terms of as actual pigs in literature of modernity. And this I found really shocking because I always had a very strong emotional bond to pigs and to farm animals in particular. And then I thought, this is such an interesting topic and I want to learn more about it. And when I then started to do some research, I actually noticed that there was little scholarship done on that topic, on that specific topic of farmed animals in literature. And that struck me as really odd because these animals are such intimate companions to humans and our relationship goes so far back. And there's so much that has been written about human-pet relationships and wild animals and so on and so forth. And so I thought, if I do a PhD, then I want to do it on farmed animals in literature. Of course, I quickly noticed while starting to research it that getting a focus on that is super tricky because there are so many different farmed animals, right? And there's so many different genres in literature. So it was kind of a tough job to actually find a focus. At one point, I thought I would just write a book about pigs in literature. Now it turned out livestock and literature still, and the focus on science and speculative fiction, because I found that this particular genre did lots of interesting things that I didn't see in many other genres.
Good. So I'd really like to dig down into why speculative fiction in particular, and why post-animals, which is this phrase that comes up again and again in your work. So perhaps you could just quickly introduce us to this idea of speculative fiction, which I know is a very kind of mainstream one in literary studies, but perhaps you don't go into a bookshop usually and see speculative fiction on a bookshelf. So what is speculative fiction? And then what are post-animals and where do they fit in speculative fiction?
Speculative fiction, at least the way that I defined it in my work, was the definition I borrowed from Donna Haraway, her notion of the SF genre, where she really focuses on the fact that in speculative fiction, we have a combination of science telling and fiction telling. So while in science fiction, we have this combination of science and fiction as well, in speculative fiction, the difference is that we are somewhat with one leg in reality and with the other we are in fiction. Science fiction does that too, of course, but at least more conventional science fiction texts tend to focus on alien planets, or they focus a lot on technology, and they mostly engage with the intersection between science and technology and culture. While speculative fiction is really looking at reality, taking things that are actually out there and then extrapolating from them and projecting them onto new worlds that they create. Why this is so interesting for me in terms of reimagining relationships to farmed animals is that the fact that these texts are rooted within reality, they can criticize what's out there in the world. They can criticize breeding strategies. They can criticize industrial animal agriculture. They can criticize that we eat animals, and also they can criticize the way in which animals are altered physiologically by means of molecular techniques, for example. This also leads me to the idea of post-animality, because very often there are many texts out there where we see animal figures or hybrid figures that have been modified by some kind of technology. These technologies can be mechanics, they can be special suits that give the being special abilities, or they can be a more abstract novum in terms of giving animal figures the ability to speak in human language and to converse with humans. There's also a book called The Awareness, where animals are given the power to read the minds of humans. And this is what makes speculative fiction so interesting for that topic, because you can introduce a critical idea about reality and then extrapolate on something unrealistic. And this mixing of conceivable or realistic and more unrealistic elements in the story can do something interesting with the way readers immerse in the book. Because while they are projecting something, which is of course a story, so it's not reality, but they connect it to things that they know from the real world. And then all of a sudden they encounter something that they do not know from the real world. And while they're immersing in the story, there might be a short moment of suspense in which they forget to draw the line between what is real and what is fiction. And I argue in the book that this moment where they forget where to draw the line, this might also be the line between a human and an animal. They might encounter a character where they are not sure, is that a human, is that an animal, is that a machine, or is that a hybrid being? And they forget to ask about that. And I think that this can have a lasting impact on their minds. Not necessarily in terms of them changing their consumer behavior afterwards or becoming an activist or something like that. I think it's the shift is temporary in nature and it's small. But I do think that the next time they encounter a pig or a cow, they might engage with it differently if they read a story like Laura Jean McKay's The Animals in That Country, where there are pigs and cows talking to humans. And I think this can have an impact on readers, and therefore I guess science and speculative fiction are really productive in that regard.
That's really fascinating, and I should mention that we actually interviewed Laura Jean McKay about the animals in that country on an earlier episode of Knowing Animals. One of the things that you mention in your introductory chapter is the idea of how speculative fiction can shape and widen horizons. So it's not just about our encounters with animals, but perhaps is it an idea of what we think is possible? Or what do you mean by that?
Yes, I think it's a good point to start with thinking about what is possible or broadening our horizons. When I concretized this idea of deindustrializing the imagination, that this is one of the functions that these texts can do, it's obviously a metaphor and it's also unrealistic. Our imaginations will never ever be deindustrialized probably. But this is an approximation that I borrowed also from cultural theories that argue that anything we see or perceive, we tend to frame through different mental patterns. This is called Gestalt theory. That's a German term. And so that means that when it comes to our encounters with cows or pigs or chickens, what we see is always filtered by what the animal industry has rooted within our minds. So that means that it's very difficult for us to actually think about and imagine a relationship to a laying hen or to a pig or even to a dairy cow, even though they might seem a little less intensively industrialized or or capitalize as other representatives of the category do. But still, many consumers do not go all the way and ask themselves, why does that cow produce milk? Does it produce milk for me, or does it produce milk for a calf? And this is what I mean by these mental frames that we can't really liberate ourselves from. Even if we are animal activists or if we are animal lovers, we can look at a pig and think, this is a being that I respect and that I do not want to eat, but I still see it as a pig that has been raised for the meat industry and that is destined to be killed. And this idea of animals being just livestock, being just meat animals, this is very deeply rooted in our Western imaginaries, and I mean in the imagination of many people from the world. And so I guess that what science and speculative fiction can do, if they are very well written and if the readers are in the right mood and if the readers are fascinated by the text and they get really into it, these short moments of suspension, they might break with these mental frames. And even if this is only for a short moment, I guess this can expand on the repertoire of what they consider conceivable. And these moments can be very short. I mean, I remember I always like to quote one passage also from Laura Jean McKay's book, where there's a cow addressing the protagonist saying, "Could it tell my babies I'm still here?" I really love this passage. It gets to me emotionally. This way of addressing the human as an it, alluding to the fact that animals are often spoken of as it and not clearly marked as female or male. And then this idea that the readers immerse themselves in the position of a cow, asking them to get a message to the dead calves. This is a moment that I think can resonate within readers' imaginations and that can shape the next time they see a cow, they might think about these calves and maybe they would start reflecting on the way they usually perceive animals.
That's really fascinating. And I know this book. This is a book that I'm familiar with. But you actually address quite a different range of stories, some of which are quite far removed from our world, some of which are a bit closer to our world, but all of them, as you say, speculative. So what other kinds of novels are you looking at, or works are you looking at? And what kinds of ways can they offer that moment of shock or that moment of widening the horizon?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess the most straightforward example for this is one of my larger case studies in the book, which is on Margaret Atwood's famous trilogy, the Mad Adam trilogy. There's a lot has been already written about this trilogy. It's super fascinating, and I could talk about this for ages probably. Really, to introduce readers who haven't read it, it's a speculative future where a mad scientist has eradicated all of humankind, except for a few surviving humans. And there are also lots and lots of biotechnologically modified animal figures roaming the wilderness. So it's like a post-apocalyptic wilderness where massive pigs are roaming freely. These pigs are called pigoons. And these pigs are super dangerous for the human protagonists because they have been altered with human DNA in their brains. Originally, that was done in order to increase the likelihood of their replacement organs being transplanted into human bodies. So they were actually, like in a pre-story of the book, these pigs were even more thoroughly commodified and capitalized as pigs are in our real world. And actually, xenotransplantation is something that is already an established research field. So this is something that actually happens. So here we have this idea of the aspect of the reality that is reworked into the story, into a more extreme version. And what is super interesting is then that, of course, once human civilization breaks down, all of these pigs break loose, and they used to be hidden behind electric fences and they were well kept. And now they are, of course, they seem pretty dangerous. So the human protagonist, called Jimmy or Snowman, he's searching for other survivors, roaming the wilderness. And he is, of course, also a little scared and sometimes a little delusional. And then he encounters these pigs and he immediately jumps to the conclusion that they want to eat him. So the climax in the first volume of the trilogy, Oryx and Crake, where he escapes from these pigs and they are chasing him and he barricades himself into a room and he keeps, for the main part of the book, he's still in a very firm position of positioning himself as superior to the pigs. While they are physically superior, he still considers himself rationally superior. But in this moment, he starts realizing that these are crafty animals, that these are planning their actions, that they are actually waiting him out. And there are these moments where he looks down to the pigs, and then the narrative suddenly shifts in perspective. So for the most part, the readers learn about the story through his eyes, but then there's a moment where they suddenly shift behind the shoulder of the pigoons as if they were seeing the scene from the pigoon's eyes. And then the text says, and now they were all looking up at him. What they see is his head attached to a delicious meat pie, just waiting to be opened up. Jimmy is imagining himself as a meat pie from the position of the pigoons. And this is a super alienating moment. If you're really immersed in the story, it can really get at you. And there's more of these moments throughout the 3 volumes of the trilogy. Also different characters, female characters, who get into similar moments of encounter. And so besides these small moments, what is actually the most interesting that I think about the novels is that, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling anyone here, but the pigoons actually turn out not so dangerous after all. So they actually turn out super social and intelligent and moral beings who actually turn out more caring about one another than the humans are. And in the end, humans and pigoons come to an agreement. They start a multi-species society and negotiate the terms of living and eating well together. The other case study that I'm dealing with in my book is on another speculative fiction novel called Bat. It was written by Adam Roberts, who's not only an author, but also a critic, like as Margaret Atwood is as well. So you really notice in both of these books that there's lots of content to talk about, also in critical animal studies terms. Bat frames a very, very different scenario. We have a dystopian future. I think it's an alternative UK version. And the setting is that animal activists have implanted microchips into the brains of all animals so that the animals can talk to humans. And I've also written about this particular book together with Nora Castle, who's also been on the podcast, about the topic of language used by animals enabled by biotechnology. So if anyone wants to hear more about that, feel free to look that up. It's in Animals and Science Fiction, the collected volume. But in terms of deindustrializing the imagination, probably one of the most interesting aspects of the book is that there is another moment in which human readers might get completely thrown off guard because they get into the story immersing themselves with a first-person narrator, which means it's a very personal story. And the first-person perspective seems to belong to a human male butcher. So they enter the story through the perspective of someone who's a convinced meat eater, who is someone who kills animals for a living and doesn't really sympathize with them. He does see some issues critically, and while the society around him throws around the order that we have in society, that meat culture is the norm and veganism, vegetarian is the subculture, and this new society turns that around. So it's actually prohibited to kill and eat animals. And the butcher is then a societal outcast who loses his job, who loses his standing, and he's trying to survive, doesn't have anyone on his side anymore. And he keeps discussing ideas about meat eating and encountering pigs who talk to him and cows that talk to him. And this is, first of all, an interesting perspective for readers to engage with these arguments from the perspective of someone who's not on their side. And in the very end of the book, it turns out, this is another spoiler, so the narrator is actually a vixen. It's not a farmed animal per se, so it's a female fox. But this female fox has been transformed by the other animals of the story world. This throws readers completely off guard because in the end, the human perspective that they have believed in all along is dismantled completely. In the very end of the book, they encounter that they've actually been seeing all of this through the perspective of a biotechnologically enabled animal.
That's fascinating. And these are two great examples. I wonder whether you think there's something distinctive about the written novel or the written short story, or whether the same kind of experience could be had through watching a speculative fiction film or maybe playing a speculative fiction video game.
That's a good question. I certainly think that similar experiences are possible. It just depends on how immersive of a gaming experience it is. I myself am not a gamer, but I do know that gamers can get really immersed in storylines. And I think video games would probably allow for a wide range of strategies of putting themselves into the shoes of a farmed animal and seeing the world through their eyes. So I haven't heard of any game, but I hope someone programs one, because that could be really enriching, especially since video games allow so much interaction and also independence from the gamers nowadays. So I think that would be a super cool game. I hope someone would fund it. In terms of films, the same might hold true, but I do think that films are a little less interactive. And films are, as much as I love films, they are it's a bit of a lazier form of entertainment. You just sit back and watch it. You get all the visual cues, you get the storyline. Of course, you have to think and you have to project and you have to connect the dots. But I do think that reading a novel and having to imagine all of this within your head is a different task for the brain. And I mean, now that would be super interesting also to do really profound neurological analysis of what happens while people read. And there's a lot being done in the field of ethical literary criticism. But so far, there's always the big challenge that proving what is happening in readers' minds is very difficult, because you cannot ever be unbiased, at least not as far as I know, but maybe some neuroscientists would know better. Proving what's actually happening in the mind, would substantiate this research. And cognitive narratologists are also working along these lines already. So I'm sure if researchers dig deeper into these processes and more is being done about the empathetic engagement readers feel towards animals while reading, I guess we could find out more about this.
I'm glad you raised this, because as I was reading your book, I was thinking about how we could prove what was happening or whether other things might be happening. And I did wonder whether there might be a danger in using some of the literary thought experiments that you use, that's a phrase you use several times, to rethink current practices. So, for example, stories about language using or hyper-intelligent animals, they might reinforce the idea that animals are worthy of respect only insofar as they have certain human features. So couldn't someone say something like, oh, sure, if cows could speak like they do in certain speculative fiction novels, we should rethink our relationships with them, but they can't speak. It strikes me that the results of exploring a literary thought experiment are, if you like, indeterminate. Different people might come away from the reading of the novel or the experience in the literary thought experiment with quite different ideas.
That's a very valid point. Actually, when I wrote the conclusion to my work, I also ended up a little disappointed with the repertoire, because in the end, it seems, at least while looking at the literature that I engaged with, which is of course limited, that if farmed animals only manage to escape being rendered killable by means of biotechnology, by means of anthropomorphization, or by means of other human-imposed elements in stories written by humans for other humans, then this obviously turns out a little disappointing. And you're right. Of course, you can't really know what a text does to a reader, especially since reading experience depends on so many factors. Where are you from? Which culture are you practicing? What has shaped you? In which situation are you reading this? Authors like Margaret Atwood or Adam Roberts, if you read these novels, you notice that they really don't leave anything to chance. So every single element in these texts is crafted. And this crafting can, of course, also be abused to other ends. Texts could also encourage people to commodify animals even more. And I think there is this increasing trend of portraying animals in science fiction text could actually lead to that. I mean, in most cases, at least many animal study scholars engaged with science and speculative fiction now, there are many interesting ideas portrayed there. And I think any time that a text actually portrays an animal figure, it's a chance for readers to engage. But if texts actually end up substantiating human exceptionalist beliefs in their underlying messages, then this is deeply problematic, because if someone gets really fascinated by a book or by a story, this could change their relationship to other animals for the worse. And biotechnology is a two-sided sword, because on the one hand, it does enhance abilities of animals in stories, but in the real world, what it does is hardly ever serving the animals, but really in most cases serving humans and serving the capitalization of animals. Richard Twine has written about this. I still think it's interesting to portray biotechnology in a critical way, because it's pretty easy in a story to point readers to this fact of the harms of technology. Even while the Piguns, for example, are super intelligent agents and they become social members of the new society, they still carry the histories of violence and the history that they've been bred and kept captive in order to produce replacement organs for the humans, and the text engages with it. But with the text not engaged with it, there are other examples in Margaret Atwood's novel, like the mohairs, for example. It's hybrids from sheep and what was the animal again? Goats, probably. Yeah, that might be true, because they're also jumping around and they have really long fur, and they were bred in order to produce hair transplants in the former world. And now they are out in the wild, and the text engages with the fact that they are utterly unfit to survive. So they try to escape from a lyobam, which is a hybrid from a lion and a lamb. And the lyobam chases the mohair, but the mohair can't run away because it just stumbles, making a rather ridiculous impression.
Now, Lisa, you're a returning guest on Knowing Animals, which means you don't get our usual 5 quick questions. Instead, you get 4 quick questions. So are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
Yes, I am.
What for you has been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting animal studies research?
The answer to that is easy. It's mostly when I get the chance to present my work to non-academic audiences. There have been some occasions when I got the chance to do that, once at an animal sanctuary, or to my friends during my PhD defense, or then also to non-animal studies audiences. Like once I taught animals in literature class to a group of veterinary students. And these moments when I feel like you surprise the audience with the fact that animals actually do many, many things that get entangled with our worlds, and that human worlds and animal worlds are not separate, but there are significant overlaps, then this is a really nice moment. These are really nice moments for me, when it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to convince people of anything. Just the simple fact of showing them an alternative way of engaging with animals is super nice. I once met the owner of an animal sanctuary, and she gave me a little tour through the farm and showed me all the animals. And then I asked her whether she can give me examples for the ways in which animals actively shape the structures of the farm or her daily life. And that made her thinking. And she got really fascinated by this idea of animal agency. And she said that it profoundly changed the way she perceives the animals on her farm. And that was one of the most rewarding moments for me.
On the flip side, what for you has been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research?
I guess that is the fact that in many everyday situations, when topics like eating meat or the ecological footprint of the animal industry, whenever these topics come up, you cannot really unthink what you have in your brain. No matter how hard I try to stay objective and not to be judgmental, to stay open, and also trying to seize the chance to not convince someone of the opposite, but actually to show someone that there are alternative views. When I notice that I fail in doing that, this really frustrates me. I do feel like beliefs in meat culture and beliefs in carnism are very deeply rooted in many people's brains. And I encounter that even with some people from my closer friend circles, that I get really surprised. And I think they are very reflective people and they are very intelligent people, but still I cannot manage to explain to them what this is all about. And these moments can be very frustrating. And it shows me that we tend to live in our vegan, vegetarian, animal activist bubbles, and think things are changing. And especially now in Germany, the debates about animal welfare reforms are really heated. So you really feel like something's changing, but in reality, the bubble is small, and there are still too few people who actually care about animals.
I think this next question is one of the hardest that I ask, but can you think of an example of an animal studies scholar that you'd like to make listeners aware of? So that might be someone who's quite new to the field, or someone who's written in the field but hasn't really received the attention they deserve, someone who doesn't write in English, someone who writes in a different discipline, someone you think our listeners should know about but probably don't.
This really is a difficult question. I thought long about this. My first thought would be Friederike Schmidt's work. She is an animal ethicist from Germany. You might have heard from her. She's pretty well known here in Germany. And she wrote this book called Anders satt. So this means in German, eating differently. And there she does an amazing job in terms of introducing an exit strategy from the animal industry in Germany. Like it's more focused on Germany, but I still think it's a great read. So I hope it's translated at some point. But maybe another text, if I may suggest one more, is it's not an animal studies scholar per se, but it's Karen Becker's The Sound of Life. It is about the many ways in which digital technologies are bringing researchers closer towards learning about more than human ways of communication. And I think this is a super interesting topic. It also connects to our discussion on the harmful ways of technology and human technology animal interactions, because I do think there's a change going on in the way in which technology is being used in order to research animal behavior, animal communication. And Karen Becker's book has so many interesting cases, like, for example, a group of researchers at the Great Barrier Reef playing fish noises at sites where coral reefs are dying in order to attract new species and to save and improve the well-being of the corals. And I do think that these new approaches offer interesting possibilities for future human-animal relationships that serve planetary habitability.
We've touched on this already, but are you optimistic about the future of human, non-human animal relationships?
Yeah, as you said with the first question, I tend to get a little disheartened when it comes to farmed animals or so-called livestock, because there's so many things are changing, and the IPCC has proclaimed shifting to plant-based food systems as the central leverage while fighting climate change 2 years ago. But still, not many things are changing. Political interventions fail to materialize, and this has so many reasons. It's like fighting Goliath, I guess. And I do fear that societies will only stop eating animals or mass producing them if they have to, if they're forced by some catastrophe or zoonotic disease that extinguishes all pigs or all cows. And this is a pretty bleak outlook. I hope this will not be the case. But I do think that in connection to other animals, things might be turning out for the better, even though biodiversity discourse has also been out there for as long as climate change discourse, and still nothing really has changed. People haven't really managed to come up with effective strategies. But I do feel that there are changes in society. Cities are being created in order to become greener and to create habitat for multi-species flourishing. Even natural horsemanship or these ideas of horseback riding are starting to become more horse-friendly. And I do feel like many humans are improving the way in which they treat their pets, or at least they are trying to understand them better. And I do think that climate change and the many challenges that we face today will force societies to change their relationships to the environment, and this necessarily entails changing their relationships to other animals.
What are you working on next?
You mentioned in the beginning that I manage the panel on planetary thinking. So this work is really shaping my research towards a little bit away from specific animal studies work and a little bit more towards multi-species studies. So at the moment, I'm working on a book project called Our Planetary Condition Towards a Politics with and Through the Earth. And I'm working on that together with my two colleagues, Klaus Leggevi and Frederik Hanusch, who are both democracy and political scientists. And they have also founded the panel. And in this book, we are trying to set the stage for the demands that more than human agencies would pose to a planetary democracy. So a democratic system that actually answers to all agents, not only to human agents, but also to non-living forces like glaciers, bodies of water, or the fundamental forces of physics, and also, of course, living agencies, which include animals, and non-living ones, which include technologies.
How can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not that active on social media. I wish I was, but I am on X. I'm also on LinkedIn. But if people want to find out more, it's probably best to follow the Instagram account of the panel, which has the handle @planetarypanel. And because from that account, you find a link tree, and whenever I publish something, it would appear in this link tree. And also you would find out more about the activities of the panel. And next year, we'll focus a lot on the topic of planetary democracy. And I'm sure there will be events interesting for animal studies scholars, because we might have Eva Meyer as our fellow if everything goes as we plan.
And that's another former guest on Knowing Animals. So yes, a lot of links to a lot of people we've featured on here. Great note to end on. So thanks so much, Lisa, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter, or X, as Lisa correctly said, @knowing_animals, and we're also on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter @JoshLMilburn, and I'm on Instagram @aveganphilosopher. I'm also on Blue Sky. Don't forget to tell others about us and review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.